Hey, altruistic followers and constructive critics, I presume you and your dear and near are fine in 2021 after dark year 2020. ED social activist come good-hearted preacher Professor S. Suresh back with a sheer for my 128th video on angle of publication on YouTube today, 31st January 2021, Sunday. The topic today is plight of migrant laborers in India. Plight of migrants, either internal as well as international also, because there are a lot of people, illegal immigrants from neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, okay, in India. As it is, the Indian population is so high here, and these illegal immigrants are adding more problems, especially Muslims. Okay. Labor is a social class comprising those who do manual labor, physical work for wages. Basically, there are two kinds of laborers: blue-collar workers and white-collar workers. White-collar workers are ones who that do planning, management, etc. Blue-collar employees are the ones who do all the physical work. In India, for blue-collar work, corporates and even households use migrant laborers since it works out much cheaper. Moreover, they are temporary contract laborers not protected by the labor laws. Hence, they are exploited to the core and suffer without any benefits: job security, insurance, low wages, etc. I have seen so many houses employing children as young as 9 or 10 years old for all the household work. They don't even provide them proper food. They abuse them in all possible ways, physically, sexually, whatever. And the salary, they don't pay any salary, even food is not provided. Okay, there is so much of physical violence. It has happened even in my relatives' houses, neighbors' houses. The condition is so pitiable, and majority of them are sexually abused. They become drug addicts, indulge in all kinds of criminal activities. Affluent people abuse these people and reap rich benefits. Labor in India refers to employment in the economy of India. In 2020, there are around 500 million workers in India, the second largest after China. China also population is very high. These are the root causes. Out of which agriculture industry consists of 41.19%, industry sector consists of 26.18%, and service sector consists 32.33% of total labor force. Of these, over 94% work in unincorporated, unorganized enterprises ranging from pushcart vendors to home-based diamond and gem polishing operations. The organized sector includes workers employed by the government, state-owned enterprises, and private sector enterprises. In 2008, the organized sector employed 27.5 million workers, of which 17.3 million work for government or government-owned entities. Over 94% of India's working population is part of the unorganized sector. That's why they are exploited. In local terms, organized sector or formal sector in India refers to licensed organizations, that is, those who are registered and pay GST. Goods and service tax. Okay. These include the publicly traded companies, incorporated or formally registered entities, corporations, factories, shopping malls, hotels, and large businesses. Unorganized sector, also known as own account enterprises, refers to all unlicensed, self-employed, or unregistered economic activities such as owner-manned general stores, handicrafts and handloom workers, rural traders, farmers, etc. India's Ministry of Labour, in its 2008 report, classified the unorganized labor in India into 4 groups. This classification categorized India's unorganized labor force by occupation, nature of employment, especially distressed categories, and service categories. The unorganized occupational groups include small and marginal farmers, landless agricultural laborers, sharecroppers, fishermen, those engaged in animal husbandry, beedi rolling, labeling and packaging, building and construction workers, leather workers, weavers, artisans, salt workers, workers in brick kilns and stone quarries, workers in sawmills, and workers in oil mills. Bonded labor system is still so much in existence in India. A separate category based on nature of employment includes attached agricultural laborers, bonded laborers, migrant workers. contract and casual laborers. Another separate category dedicated to distressed unorganized sector includes toddy tappers, scavengers, carriers of headloads, drivers of animal-driven vehicles, loaders and unloaders. The last unorganized labor category includes service workers such as midwives, domestic workers, barbers, vegetable and fruit vendors, newspaper vendors, payment vendors, hand cart operators, and the unorganized retail. The unorganized sector has low productivity and offers lower wages. Even though it accounted for over 94% of workers, India's unorganized sector created just 57% of India's national domestic product (NDP) in 2006, or about ninefold less per worker than the organized sector. The productivity gap sharply worsens when rural unorganized sector is compared to urban unorganized sector, with the gross value added productivity gap spiking an additional 2 to 4-fold depending on occupation. Some of lowest income jobs are in the rural unorganized sectors. Poverty rates are reported to be significantly higher in families where all working age members have only worked the unorganized sector throughout their lives. Agriculture, dairy, horticulture, and related occupations alone employ 41.49% of labor in India. Around 30 million workers are migrant workers. Most in agriculture and local stable employment is unavailable for them. India's National Sample Survey Office in its 67th report found that unorganized manufacturing, unorganized trading, retail, and unorganized services employed about 10% each of all workers nationwide as of 2010. In India, in so many states like Bihar, Jharkhand, and all that, they see to that, the politicians see to that the people are illiterates. They do not want the population to get education. They purposely keep them illiterate so that they can be exploited. And they indulge in all sorts of crime. In Bihar, Jharkhand, especially. Most of them are real criminals, hardcore criminals. You can get a country-made gun for 500 rupees also in Jharkhand, Bihar. It also, recently there was election in Bihar, Jharkhand and all that. It was reported in the media that more than 50% of the contestants in the elections that was held were real hardcore criminals. It also reported that India had about 58 million unincorporated non-agricultural enterprises in 2010. The organized private sector with more than 10 employees per company, the biggest employers in 2008 were manufacturing at 5 million, social services at 2.2 million, which includes private schools and hospitals, finance at 1.1 million, which includes bank, insurance, and real estate, and agriculture at 1 million. India had more central and state government employees in 2008 than employees in all private sector companies combined. That may not be true. If state-owned companies and municipal government employees were included, India had a 1.8 to 1 ratio between public sector employees and private sector employees. In government, this thing, most of the people do not do the work. They get all benefits. They get time-based promotions and time-based increments, increase in DA, bonus, but they don't do any work. If there are 10 people in government offices, only one person does the work. 9 people are happily enjoying. They'll sign the attendance register and disappear, do all the personal work outside during working hours. You cannot find them in the seat. And besides that, there is so much corruption. If you don't pay them the bribe, nothing gets done. Even a form, you will do for a form in government offices, you will have to pay money. It is supposed to be given for free. In terms of gender equality and employment, and there is so much of red tapeism also in government offices. The same file will move from table to table unnecessarily, wasting our time, and each and every time it has to move from one table to another, you will have to bribe. Otherwise, the file will be collecting dust in one table itself for years together. In terms of gender equality in employment, male to female ratio was 5.5 to 1 in government and government-owned enterprises. Private sector had better a 3 to 1 ratio. Combined, counting only companies with more than 10 employees per company, the organized public and private sector employ 5 million women and 22 million women. Given its natural rate of population growth and aging characteristics, India is adding about 13 million new workers every year to its labor pool. They say, India is a second in terms of population. That is not true. Because the last census, if I remember right, it was taken in 2011. Even that time, they did not include all the people living on the streets. India, so many people live on the streets. India's population definitely has surpassed China a long time back. but they don't accept. Okay. Population explosion is a main cause for all these social evils. India's economy has been adding about 8 million new jobs every year, predominantly in low-paying, unorganized sector. The remaining 5 million youth joining the ranks of poorly paid partial employment, casual labor pool for temporary infrastructure and real estate construction jobs are in many cases being unemployed. In 1995, India had 10 central federations of trade unions, namely arranged by number of member unions in 1980, INTUC, CITU, BMS, AITUC, HMS, and NLO, UTUC, AIUTUC, NFITU, and TUCC. Each federation had numerous local trade union affiliates, with the smallest TUCC with 65 and INTUC with 1,604 affiliated unions. By 1989, BMS has become India's largest federation of unions with 3,117 affiliated unions, while INTUC remained the largest federation by combined number of members at 2.2 million. The largest federation of trade unions, INTUC, represents about 0.5% of India's labor force in unorganized sector. All these trade union leaders are minting money. The benefits do not reach the employees. The trade union trade union leaders are getting so much hefty commission from corporates, saying that they are negotiating with the management. They are negotiating for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the employees in general. In 2010, over 98% of Indian workers did not belong to any trade unions and are not covered by any collective bargaining agreements. India has two broad groups of migrant laborers, one that migrates to temporarily work people from Bangladesh work overseas, another that migrates domestically on a seasoned and work available basis. There has been a substantial flow of people from Bangladesh and Nepal, Myanmar, Sri Lanka to India over recent decades in search of better work. As I told you, India itself is struggling. Why these people migrate to India? Cheating Indians, saying that they are doing business, Yavaram in Tamil, in slang Tamil. Researchers at the Overseas Development Institute found that these migrant workers ,100% of these illegal immigrants are in business. Okay. These migrant workers are often subject to harassment, violence, and discrimination during the journeys of their destinations and when they return home. Domestic migrant workers have been estimated to be about 4.2 million. Domestic workers, not domestic migrant workers. These workers range from full-time to part-time workers, temporary or permanent workers. They are typically employed for remuneration or in cash or kind, any household through any agency or directly to do the household work, but do not include any member of the family of an employer. This abuse is very much prevalent in Middle Eastern countries. They say you have to do a nursing job, but it won't be nursing job. It will be sexual harassment, servant maids, nurses. They will have to take care of some elderly person. That person will abuse them anyway as they please. Even branding them with a hot iron and all that. Some of these work exclusively for a single employer, while others work for more than one employer. Some are live-in workers, while some are seasonal. The employment of these migrant workers is typically at the will of the employer and the worker, and compensation varies. In most of the Middle Eastern countries, you cannot even acquire any property. That's a rule. And so many countries, if you want to leave the country, you have to get an exit visa. In all other countries, only to enter the country, you should have a visa. In so many Middle Eastern countries, especially Iran and all that, you should get an exit visa from that country for leaving the country. Things are that bad. So many Indians are working in Middle Eastern countries in construction and oil rigs. So many of them lose their life because they don't take any safety measures. People die. They don't even return the body to their families properly. About 4 million Indian origin laborers, you know about Burj Khalifa. biggest building in the world as of today. I think some other buildings are coming up. You know how many Indians worked in that on that site? So many of them fell down, lost their life. Burj Khalifa. About 4 million Indian origin laborers are migrant workers in the Middle East alone. This is what I said. Most of them are doing menial jobs like construction, oil rigs, doing all the hard work. They are credited to have been the majority of workers who built many of Dubai, Bahrain, Qatar, and Persian Gulf modern architecture, including the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in world's history, which opened in January 2010. It is not the tallest actually. No. These migrant workers are attracted by better salaries, typically US dollars 2 to 5 per hour, possibly of earning overtime pay and opportunity to remit funds to support their families in India. But most of them are exploited. The agents who take them there promise high salaries, but they loot and their passports are seized by their employers or these agents, so they cannot even leave the country. Their living conditions are so pitiable. One small room, 10 by 10 size, 10 foot by 10 foot size, 15, 20 of them will be forced to share. Not a good looking this thing, very old building, whatever. They don't even pay them proper salary. The Middle East based migrant workers from India remitted about $20 billion in 2009. Once the projects are over, they are required to return at their own expenses with no employment or social security benefits. Yeah, there are a lot of people in hard work, construction, oil rigs, even drivers, teachers, in teaching, nursing, but most of them are sexually exploited, physically exploited. In some cases, labor abuses such as unpaid salaries, unsafe work conditions, and poor living conditions have been claimed. Indian migrant workers during the COVID-19 pandemic have faced multiple hardships. With the factories and workplaces shut down due to the lockdown imposed in the country, millions of migrant workers had to deal with the loss of income, food shortages, and uncertainty about the future. Following this, many of them and their families went hungry. Thousands of them then began walking back home with no means of transport due to the lockdown. Due to the lockdown, more than 300 deaths were reported till 5th May 2020. These are official counts. The unofficial count will be much higher, 10 times this, with the reasons ranging from starvation, suicides, exhaustion, road and rail accidents, police brutality, and denial of timely medical care. Among the reported deaths, most were among the marginalized migrants and laborers. 80 died while traveling back home on the Shramik special trains in the 1 month since their launch. In response, the central and state governments took various measures to help them and later arranged to transport them. Bonded labor is a forced relationship between an employer and an employee where the compulsion is derived from the outstanding debt. Often the interest accrues at a rate that is so high that the bonded labor lasts very long periods of time or indefinitely. Sometimes the employee has no options for employment in the organized or unorganized sectors in India and prefers the security of any employment, including any offered in bonded labor form. While illegal, bonded labor relationships may be reinforced by force or they may continue from custom. Once an employee enters into a bonded relationship, they are characterized by asymmetry of information, opportunity, no time to search for alternative jobs, and high exit costs. According to data from census year 2011, number of child laborers is 10.1 million, 5.6 million, and 4.5 million girls in India. I think this was the last official census in India, if I remember right. Total of 152 million children, 64 million girls, and 88 million boys are estimated to be in child labor globally, for almost 1 in 10 in all children worldwide. Poverty, lack of schools, poor education infrastructure, and growth of unorganized economy are considered as the most important causes of child labor in India. Politicians, they create situations like that so that it is beneficial to them. They do not want the people to get the education. Then they start thinking, no, they do not want that to happen. Article 24 of India's constitution prohibits child labor, but only in factories, mines, or hazardous employment. The Indian Penal Code, IPC, the Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children Act 2000, and the Child Labor Prohibition and Abolition Act 1986 provide a basis in law to identify, prosecute, and stop child labor in India. Nevertheless, child labor is observed in almost all unorganized, small-scale, informal sectors of the Indian economy. Scholars suggest inflexibility and structure of India's Labor market size of informal economy, legal hurdles preventing industries from scaling up, and lack of modern manufacturing technologies are major macroeconomic factors encouraging demand and for an acceptability of child labor. The labor laws of India originated and expressed the socio-political views of leaders such as Nehru. Okay. From pre-1947, Jawaharlal Nehru. From pre-1947 independence movement struggle. These laws were expanded in part of the debates, part after debates in constituent assemblies, and in part from international conventions and recommendations such as International Labour Organization, ILO. The current mosaic of Indian laws and employment are thus a combination of India's history during a colonial heritage, India's experiments with the socialism, important human rights, and the conventions and standards that have emerged from the United Nations, UN. The laws cover the right to work of one's choice, right against discrimination, prohibition of child labor, fair and human conditions of work, social security, protection of wages, redress of grievances, right to organize and form trade unions, collective bargaining, and participation in management. India has numerous labor laws such as those prohibiting discrimination and child labor, those that aim for guarantee fair and human conditions of work, those that provide social security, minimum wage, right to organize, form trade unions, and enforce collective bargaining. India also has numerous rigid regulations such as maximum number of employees per company in certain sectors of the economy, and limitations on employers on retrenchment and layoffs, requirement of paperwork, bureaucratic process, and government approval for change in labor in companies, even if these are because of economic conditions. Indian labor laws are considered to be very highly regulated and rigid as compared to those of other countries in the world. That's what they say. It doesn't work out that way in real life because of corruption. The intensity of these laws have been criticized as the cause of low employment growth, large unorganized sectors, underground economy, and low per capita income, underground economy, shadow economy. These have led many to demand reforms for labor market flexibility in India. India has over 50 major acts and numerous laws that regulate employers in matters relating to industrial relations, employee unions, as well as who, how, and when enterprises can employ or terminate employment. Many of these laws survive from British colonial times, while some have been enacted after India's independence from Britain. India is a federal form of government. Labor is a subject of the concurrent list of the Indian Constitution, and therefore labor matters are in the jurisdiction of both central and state governments. Both central and state governments have enacted laws on labor relations and employment issues. Some of the major laws relevant to India are Workmen's Compensation Act of 1923, Trade Unions Act of 1926, Payment of Wages Act of 1936, Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act of 1946, Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, Minimum Wages Act of 1948, Industries Regulation and Development Act 1951, Employees Provident Fund, EPF, and Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 1952, Maternity Benefit Act of 1961, Payment of Bonus Act of 1965, Payment of Gratuity Act of 1972. There are so many rules and regulations, but they are not enforced. That's a problem. It's of no use having rules and regulations unless otherwise it is enforced. It is just otherwise it's just window dressing. That's what happens in India. Window dressing. Eyewash. Scholars suggest India's rigid labor laws and excessive regulations assumed to protect the labor are the cause of slow employment growth in high-paying organized sector. India's labor-related acts and regulations have led to labor market rigidity. This encourages shadow economy. That's what I said. Underground economy for entrepreneurs, an economy that prefers to employ informal labor to avoid the complicated and opaque class. Government knows all these things, but they get money, so they keep quiet. They look the other direction. I do not know, they say. In particular, Indian labor legislation such as the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947 added rigid labor laws and one-sided trade union laws. Although the Act does not prohibit layoffs and retrenchments, it does require entrepreneurs and companies to get the permission from government officials to fire an employee for absenteeism, retrench employees for economic reasons, or to choose an economically non-viable company. This bureaucratic process can stretch into years. The government officials have consistently and almost always denied such permission. As a result, the scholars argue that India's inflexible labor laws have created a strong incentive to formally register new companies and hire additional workers in existing unorganized sector companies. Unlike China, Indian businesses have avoided substituting India's abundant labor for export or domestic opportunities or use labor instead of expensive equipment for quality control or other operations. These are reasons for India's weak employment growth. Social security is a fundamental right of labor which is guaranteed by law to all human beings who live their own labor and who find themselves unable to work temporarily or permanently for the control. In terms of social security, the first beginnings were made at the time of French Revolution when a declaration of the rights of man was proclaimed, human beings. It served as a preamble to the French Constitution of 1793, which stated, inter alia, public assistance is a sacred duty. According to Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every member of society has a right to social security. The ILO Declaration, International Labour Organization Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, is a major step in this direction. Development must bring about an improvement in the living conditions of people. It should therefore ensure the provisions of basic human needs at that. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the United Nations is another international instrument bestowing workers with economic, social and cultural rights so that they enjoy these rights of self-determination, can freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. The Indian Constitution, GOI 19, Government of India, 1991 provides for citizenship rights in Part 2. Citizenship rights are regarded as fundamental because they are most suitable, essential for the attainment of the individual of his full intellectual, moral and spiritual status. The guarantee of the minimum rights of the workplace will enable people to claim and realize a fair share of the wealth. The guarantee of these rights will ensure a process of translating economic growth into social equality. The development thus becomes synonymous with the agenda of integrated development according to directive principles of state policy of the Indian Constitution. Again, GOI 1991, the state is required to secure for the citizens, both men and women, to right to an adequate means of livelihood, equal pay for equal work of both men and women. But there is so much disparity between males and females. Glass ceiling. You know about glass ceiling? Okay, protection against abuse and exploitation of females. However small they are, it is very tough to rise to the highest levels in organizations. That is what we call a glass ceiling. But nowadays it's all changing, especially in developed countries. Economic necessity, protection of the health and strength to secure for children opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner and in conditions of freedom and dignity, and protect children and the youth adolescents against exploitation. You can talk about these things, but it's not still the and moral and material abandonment. The state is also required to secure equal justice and free legal aid to make effective provisions for right to work, to education, and to public assistance in cases of undeserved want, to ensure just and human conditions of work and maternity relief, to secure work, a living wage, and a decent standard of life, to participation of workers in the management of industries. However, citizenship rights are essential for the development of the citizens of the country. According to Thorat in 2008, in incomplete citizenship of denial of civil rights. That is happening. Denial of civil rights, freedom of expression. Otherwise, it's not a democratic country. Freedom of expression, rule of law, right to justice, political rights, right and means to participation in the exercise of political power. Politicians are abusing the powers that they get. And socio-economic rights, right to poverty, employment, and education are key dimensions of an improvised life. Besides, we need to recognize that the right to move freely from one part of the territory of a country to another, or one part of the globe to another, is a basic right which should not be denied to workers. There are 4 categories of law as per ILO, such as right to freedom of association and collective bargaining, elimination of forced labor, elimination of child labor, elimination of discrimination in matter of occupation and wages. Generally, there are 2 basic factors of migration: distance and duration. From the distance point of view, migration can be classified under 4 categories: rural to rural, rural to urban, urban to rural, urban to urban. Besides, migration can be divided into following categories: intra-district, inter-district, intrastate, interstate, national, and international. From the duration point of view, migration can be studied under three categories: casual, temporary, periodic, seasonal. Permanent. In late March 2020, as India started at the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, Vijay Singh and 6 other men embarked on a 1,700 kilometers journey from Chennai to the village in West Bengal. They were tribal migrant workers from Bangidip, a village in the Purulia district, about 350 kilometers from state capital Kolkata. Upon reaching Bangidip, they quarantined themselves outside the village perimeters. Fearing attacks from elephants, they tied carts with mosquito nets high up on mango and banyan trees and would only come down for food that their family members left nearby. It took almost a week before the news reached the district administration and they made alternative arrangements. On the whole, the outbreak, albeit alarming, has not yet reached critical proportions till April 2020. Now it is not so. It is January 2021. The total number of cases is inching towards 5,000 that time, with 124 reported deaths. Many reports, that is in April 2020, very old one. Okay. Many reports, however, doubt these numbers, claiming that the test rate in India is among the lowest in the world. There is a fear that India could be weeks away from a major surge in cases which could overwhelm its crippling public health system. This was the situation in April 2020. However, despite the government's announcement of a $22.6 billion US stimulus package, the lockdown is a severe crisis for India's migrant laborers. It is people like Singh, part of an estimated 453.6 million of India's internal migrants, who are suffering from the worst. So with the daily wages having dried up, most of them can barely afford rent or even food in the cities and are thus left with a little choice but attempt a journey home by any means possible. In what is the greatest, it's all history now. Okay. It is people like Singh, part of the estimated 453.6 million of India's Indians who are suffering from the worst. With their daily wages having dried up, okay, these things they are left with a little no choice but attempt a journey by any means possible to their home. In what is the greatest exodus since partition, this unprecedented flight of migrants from different parts of the country to the villages, especially from Delhi and National Capital Region, NCR, has made international headlines. Stories from the ground signal the advent of desperate times. There are reports of workers stuck in informal settlements into detention camps, health officials using hose pipes to douse migrant laborers in disinfectant, and people attempting to walk hundreds of kilometers to reach home and even dying en route. As the plight of Singh and his fellow travelers shows, there is also fear and panic that those returning may spread the virus. Further, especially with authorities resorting to cramming people onto buses and into relief camps and homeless shelters. Delhi NCR remains a major destination for the North Indian migrants that form a sizable group among the internal migrants in the country. In India, cities in the NCR like Noida have been receiving a high number of migrants over the last few decades, particularly from eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal, owing to a spate of industrial and construction activities. They work as street vendors, construction workers, security guards, housemaids, etc., living in rented accommodation in the urban villages of the city. Local villages derive a significant income from these rentals. In most villages, a landlord has dozens of identical rooms for rent, set in rows or floors in narrow alleyways. Most house owners also run grocery shops from which tenants are expected to make their purchases. Notwithstanding this, for the landlords, these migrant tenants remain the perennial outsiders, while they themselves are the original inhabitants of the area. They frequently complain that the villages have become almost like slums. Furthermore, over and above the difficulty of cohabiting in dense urban spaces, tenants are also seen as carrying the risk of cultural contamination. due to the food practices, their origin and Bangladesh, or for the supposed lack of personal hygiene, tenants are the social others in the city, outcasts. The migrants themselves take a dim view of their landlords' exaggerated lifestyles as the unearned privileges of an urban location. You know, this pandemic, they say it spread from China, and people from northeastern parts of India, they look like Chinese, Mongol origin. They were abused in so many cities in India, including Tamil Nadu. Even shopkeepers refuse to sell them any items. There is evidence that it is becoming increasingly harder for migrant workers to secure a margin of economic and spatial stability in Noida. The small-scale manufacturing sector in the city has seen sharp casualization of employment since 1991. But the manufacturing and construction sectors were also severely hit by demonetization in 2016, which forced thousands of workers to shift to lower wage service sectors. The sector works, barring those who have nothing left in villages to return to. Most migrants are thus naturally compelled to still think of their villages as spaces of belonging and refuge during the present crisis. Yet it is also evident that going back to a rural home has never been more challenging than during the coronavirus lockdown. It's so pathetic. There are a lot of videos and all that. As several analysts have pointed out, forms of openness and flows have attracted unprecedented boundaries in rural India. They were treated worse than rats, bandicoots. Migrants will save up on rent even when they reach home. They could also draw on ecological and social commons that some villages still have left outside of a market price-based system. Formal money and food transfers from the state will come and be provided that the coverage is brought, but it is unclear for how long these insufficient safety nets could sustain the migrants. Besides, with the rural economy hurtling towards a contraction, the exodus will drag local wages down. The rush for home could ironically produce an even more pronounced crisis at home. Anthropologist Henrik Wigg observes that we commonly frame a crisis as a rupture in isolation, fragmenting the coherence of our otherwise orderly lives. But drawing on ethnographics of conflict and crisis across African and Latin American societies, he suggests that there is often a constant prospect of crisis woven into the social fabric in contemporary times. This anthropological approach of crisis as context offers a productive lens to understand how migrant workers in Noida and other Indian cities respond to one crisis after another. While the pandemic is undoubtedly creating an unprecedented livelihood dislocation, newer cities like Noida have been facing conflicting moral ethos and social crises for decades. For long, the migrants have confronted an anti-migrant attitude on one hand and precarious employment opportunities on the other. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated and personalized this endemic context of crisis for the migrants. There is now an experience of radical limitation of one's agency at one's place of work as well as at one's place of refuge, leading to experiences of truncation of horizons and opacity of futures and possibilities. But it is set amidst a context of chronic and persistent social crisis. The concept of crisis as context also connects with Walter Benjamin's rejoinder to traditional Marxism in his essay, The Concept of History. Benjamin's point is that the present of the oppressed is never an exception that is disconnected from its social past. Analogously, the current state of exception facing the migrant workers in India is barely an exception. Rather, it is temporally connected to, that is forming a tradition of multiple and ever-deepening fractures of lived spaces, histories, and livelihoods in the everyday existence. Globally, the condition of migrant workers has witnessed an ugly truth since the outbreak of pandemic. World over, the number of internal migrants is about 2.5 times that of international migrants. In India, it is estimated that around 139 million internal migrant workers travel to cities from villages for work in the informal sector, which accounts unorganized. That's why they get exploited in all possible ways that one can think of. which constitutes almost 80% of the Indian workforce for the disempowered workmen. Migration to urban economic centers provides an escape from poverty and unemployment. With the lockdown, not only did the factories, establishments, and workplaces heavily dependent upon migrant workers shut down, but their means of being transported to the secure native place was also stopped. The loss of employment, starvation from hunger, eviction due to non-payment of rent, and lack of effective means to return back to their villages were amplified in greater measure due to the outbreak of the pandemic. The initial reaction of the government was to transport migrant workers back to the native stations, which failed miserably for lack of preparedness and risk of virus spreading en masse. As many as 500,000 to 600,000 workers had to walk back home on foot in the absence of any transportation options. The lockdown also led to many law and other order issues in as much as the absence of state being able to restrain workers from venturing out. Law enforcement agencies had to employ means to curtail actions that breached statutory compliances. Many died while walking hundreds of miles and some even committed suicide. On 23rd March 2020, ILO released the International Labour Standards relevant to the evolving COVID-19 outbreak. India looked towards its domestic legislation, which unfortunately proved futile and inadequate to deal with the migrant workers' situation. The fact that there is already in existence law for internal migrant workers provided hope. However, the enforcement of this law has never been validated. The problem is in enforcement, not with the laws. The Interstate Migrant Workmen Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act 1979 was enacted to regulate the service conditions of interstate laborers. Specifically provides that every worker should be enrolled as a source and destination. States in India to ensure safe migration, prevention of exploitation, and protection of the rights. They do not know what the rights are. They don't even have that awareness. Because of the illiteracy, it is a duty of the employers to provide for accommodation, sanitation facilities, healthcare, etc. But most employers do not register themselves, and thereby the workers are unable to avail the benefits of this law in this crisis. Therefore, domestic worker coming from interstate and working as house help, or with unregistered employers cannot avail the provisions of this act, and this led to a cascading impact, leaving hundreds of migrant laborers stranded. While the government could not enforce this particular enactment, they had to come up with immediate policy decisions and advisories to assist the migrant workers. The government set up camps with the basic provisions to provide shelter to stranded migrants. It also took measures to distribute food on a massive scale and insisted that the employers pay wages and landlords to waive rents. On 26 March 2020, the Union Finance Minister announced packages under the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana, translates as Prime Minister's Poor Welfare Scheme, under which an amount of rupees 1.7 lakh crores was allocated to assist migrant workers, sanitation workers, accredited social health activists, as well as urban and rural poor via direct benefit transfers, DBT. Schemes are there, but they are not implemented properly because of corruption. With their accounts and through food rations available through administrative routes. Regional efforts taken by the government have also been documented, but there are reasonable doubts that this help will not reach the migrant workers. That is what is happening. Government assistance never reaches the downtrodden and the poor. Even farmers. Government says that they are giving so much subsidy to the farmers, so much money. It doesn't reach them. Further, the scheme is not specifically targeted towards migrant workers alone. The apprehensions proved accurate when, in the absence of a structured dispersal of food ration and distribution of cooked food, many workers were left stranded for days without access to food, despite the system of community kitchens. I have seen so many videos, pictures, whatever, being an Indian. Thereafter, the Ministry of ashamed to say I'm an Indian. Thereafter, the Ministry of Home Affairs issued a specific advisory on 27th March 2020 to all states in India to take immediate provisions to support in the form of food and shelter to different migrant workers, including those from unorganized sector. Another advisory was issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs on 20th April 2020, which divided the migrant workers into three categories based on the locations where the migrant workers are currently situated. Firstly, migrant workers who are in the cities of the local residents. Secondly, migrant workers who are on their way and are yet to reach their destination city, village. Thirdly, migrant workers who have reached their destination. Those migrant workers who are on their way and are yet to reach their destination have been instructed to be kept in quarantine centers. That is worse than jails, actually. They sprayed insecticides, saying that will sanitize them. The latest advisory suggests that migrant workers will be able to go home in sanitized buses and will be kept in quarantine. However, the implementation remains under question. Thus, while the government is attempting to provide all possible measures, reports have shown that people are trying to escape from the quarantine shelters because it's like a jail. No freedom, nothing. They are abused as there is overcrowding also. Basic facilities like food and hygiene. While auditory, the policy decisions and advisories by the government have assisted workers only temporarily. The loss of employment and livelihood, along with the inability to reach the agricultural fields to cater to crops, will cause a huge socio-economic meltdown. Training to deal with the situation caused Indian health workers to spray a group of migrant workers with the disinfectants consisting of bleaching powder and jets of sodium hypochlorite. This is what I said. Sodium hypochlorite is a poison. They sprayed it on the faces and all that. And some industries, they even came up with so-called tunnels through which the employees need to walk through before they enter the factory, spraying sodium hypochlorite. It's a poison to prevent the spread of coronavirus. World Health Organization clearly stated that there is no sanitizer that is effective against this coronavirus. Now it has mutated. It is much more vigorous, especially the South African variant. No vaccine will act effectively against such mutated virus. Even the existing this thing, it is not 100% effective. Some companies haven't even completed the third phase of trials, but they are using it on real people, saying mass immunization and all that. And even doctors are staying away from getting immunized, going for these so-called vaccine shots. That clearly proves that they know the efficiency of the vaccine or the adverse effects of these vaccines that are being administered. Consequently, in all other countries, the politicians took the shots first. In India, it doesn't happen. No politician has taken the vaccine yet, except a few. Consequently, check in other countries. All the leaders have taken the vaccine shots first. Consequently, immediate action was ordered against these officials. This even prompted the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to call upon the Indian police forces to show restraint and abide by international standards. Leaders need to lead by example. They never do that in India. And abide by international standards on the use of force and human treatment in the efforts to respond to this pandemic. Reports abundant of the difficulties faced by workers in reaching their hometowns, including being stopped and questioned to the point of harassment, being made to pay bribe for what was supposed to be free transport services. Yeah. They are made to force pay through the nose, even for a train journey, which are supposed to be free by the government, for what are supposed to be free transport services and often being inhumanly treated. So many of them died during travel itself. Some trains went to the wrong place also. I don't know how these things happen. COVID-19 has exacerbated a lot of social problems and behavioral changes. Mob lynching or violent violence has become a commonplace menace in India, particularly during this pandemic. Previously, vigilantism and lynching was targeted against minorities of a particular caste or religion as means of instant justice. In Tassi in yes, Punawala versus Union of India, the Supreme Court of India laid down guidelines in mob violence and lynching cases. However, there is no specific law relating to lynching as of now. While the usual cases of lynching are a product of dominant narrative, wherein people who do not fit into the narrative are outcast. In COVID-19, such as a narrative is a fear of the disease and lack of awareness to its spread. Villages across India reportedly erected barricades, dumping trees or dug trenches to stop outsiders from entering the villages and appointed guards at entry points. This has led to the emergence of a new category of violent social boycotting. Social boycotts are instruments of exclusion. Reports show a man was lynched to death for informing the local coronavirus health center about some workers who had returned to his village from another state. He was lynched. In another incident, a mob attacked the medical team, including a police patrol car, after they got information that some people had returned from New Delhi and West Bengal. Few migrant workers seeking to return home were refused entry to the villages, and they were forced to take temporary shelter in trees for days. Thus, lack of policy and awareness has perpetuated friction in the society. Enmity. The government officials started posting posters on the wall of every house with members who have been quarantined, and this has led to fears of stigmatization among people. It happened even in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, capital of Tamil Nadu. Hands of those who are quarantined were stamped to ensure that they stay at home as if they are animal cattle. While prevention is pertinent, it is argued that vigilantism by neighbors and social ostracization, boycotting, will lead to fear and eventually non-reporting. Such disclosure even prevented people from infected houses venturing out with the tin sheets and all that. After some time, the courts intervened and they removed such, because I have seen that happen in the area where I live. Such disclosure has been argued to be a violation of right to privacy and dignity of the individuals. Article 21 of the Constitution of India, as well as the basic human rights. Therefore, apart from the economic stratification that migrant workers are facing, there is an increased violation of their fundamental rights and human rights, including right to shelter, livelihood, privacy, dignity, and right to life. Coronavirus pandemic will affect the societies for a long time, particularly the marginalized. The lockdown has caused several human rights violations for migrant workers and has led to the increased social stigma and boycotting. As new form of lynching arising from fear has also emerged. While the government has announced several schemes, there is a lot of apprehension about the enforcement. There are international organizations like UN ILO who are aware of these premeditated human rights violations, but they haven't taken any actions whatsoever in this regard. It is as good as not having any such organizations, since they are supposed to be the watchdogs for the society and prevent the human beings' abuse in whatever form it is. Let them not pretend that they are not aware. Pretensions never help. There are umpteen organizations for the protection of animals. ASPCA, PETA, Blue Class, PFA, so many things. Hundreds of organizations are there for the protection of animals. First are humanitarian virtues and prevent human abuse. That is the foremost duty of any human being. And raise your voice for the protection of monkeys, pigs, dogs, cats, cows, etc. Act as human beings and not as psychopaths. Debates, discussion on open-ended topics like this can go on forever. Here, let me pull the plug here. We'll meet again real soon with another interesting topic. Some of the statements used expressed are solely mine, based on limited knowledge gained over 6 decades of versatile experience. Always watch these videos with the closed captions, subtitles for absolute 100% comprehension as my sincere recommendation zillion times so far. I know I rushed through to complete the presentation within 20 minutes max, which is a norm that I had set myself to retain the viewer's attention. I am quite aware of the fact that I exceed this time limit. Sometimes I take double or even triple this time depending on the topic, since I make honest attempts to cover the selected topic more elaborately, including so many intricate fine details, referring a wide variety of sources, in particular Wikipedia quite extensively, besides articles and books published recently. Besides, of course, I sprinkle my own salt and pepper and season it with my personal experiences so far in my life, and also intuition. Stay at home as much as possible to maintain social distancing attributed to pandemic novel COVID-19 and prolong your lifespan. Lead a healthy life. God, also known as a supreme power, is the one and only one who can put a stop to natural, unnatural, biowar and cyber war events like pandemics and epidemics, which ultimately paves the way for apocalypse and extinction of all sentient species of earth for no fault of others. Rest in peace and harmony. Today I must have taken triple the time. I am almost correct. I have taken around 56.15 minutes.